Welcome, everybody. Good morning to those of us here in London, and good morning, good afternoon to those of us online. Welcome to the event, Ending the Rohingya Crisis, What Will It Take? Just a few notes before we get going. We are going to have a bit of a discussion here with panelists here in London and also online, and then turn the Q&A over to you. There is an event hashtag for this. This is a public event, so please feel free to tweet. The hashtag is Rohingya Crisis, hashtag Rohingya Crisis. But please turn your phones to silent so that we don't get an interruption during the meeting itself. Also, just to be aware that we've got 3 panelists online today, many of them in country working on the response itself. So I'm very grateful to them to have taken some time out to speak to us today. But what that does mean is we may experience some technical difficulties during the actual event. I just ask all of you to be patient with us as we try to resolve those as best we can. So let's get started. Maybe just as a bit of background, but I don't think for this audience it needs a lot of introduction. You know, we've seen 430,000 Rohingya fleeing into Bangladesh in the last few weeks in a new wave of violence that marks a major escalation in this conflict. The UN has recently acknowledged this as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Yesterday, the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, called this the worst refugee crisis or the most urgent refugee crisis of our time. But I think we feel that these labels, while helpful, I mean, the rhetoric is now starting to be there, but they won't do anything until they actually spark concerted action by the governments in Myanmar and the surrounding countries and by the international community in general. You know, and I think it's safe to say that this is not a new situation for the Rohingya. The Rohingya are described as some of the most persecuted people in the world. They've been living essentially stateless in Myanmar. And during the course of years and decades, they've fled to seek asylum in Bangladesh, in India, in Thailand, and in Malaysia. But these neighboring countries are reluctant hosts and not necessarily offering the type of assistance and protection that they need. The international community has somewhat turned a blind eye to what's happening to the Rohingya in these countries. And just a bit of a plug here. In fact, we did a report on this. HPG has done a report last year on the Rohingya in Malaysia, documenting exactly what's happening to them as asylum seekers in Malaysia. And what our research found is that actually, you know, the state policies in Malaysia are actually limiting their ability to get assistance and protection from both the government and the aid community. And I think we're starting to see some signs of this happening in Bangladesh as well. Bangladesh may be going down the same route. So what can we do to ensure that this doesn't happen? So today, you know, what I'd like to do is, you know, we've assembled a very expert panel of people who have recently been in Bangladesh, in Myanmar, who are there now, who are responding to the crisis. And I'd like everybody here to get a flavor of what the situation looks like on the ground. We've been hearing lots about fake news from both sides. You know, what does that look like from sort of an eyewitness account? You know, what are the immediate needs, but also what in the longer term do we need to do to ensure that this kind of neglect doesn't happen in the future? So before getting started in our discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Here in London, we have Dennis McNamara, who is a senior humanitarian advisor for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva. Prior to that, Dennis has worked for more than 3 decades in international humanitarian assistance and held many senior positions across the United Nations and including at UNHCR. Online today, we have Dirk Hebecker, who is the senior coordinator for Bangladesh Refugee Emergency at UNHCR. He's also the UNHCR representative in Japan, and I think he's now been deployed to Bangladesh to deal with the emergency. Also online today, we have Lilian Fan, who is the international director and co-founder of the Gutaino Foundation, which in Aceh language means all of us. Is that correct, Lilian? Yes. Yeah. It's a humanitarian organization based in Aceh, Indonesia. She's also the deputy chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. Lilian is also an HPG research associate and a former staff member here. So good to see you again, Lilian. And finally, we have Ro Ne San Luin, who is a Rohingya human rights activist and blogger. He was born in the Rakhine State and raised in Rangoon, also known as Yangon, and has been documenting cases of human rights violations in Arakan State of Myanmar. So he will be with us. He's speaking to us from sort of the diaspora community of the Rohingya. Okay, so just to get started, maybe I'll first turn to Dennis. Dennis, you've just returned from Bangladesh, where the Bangladeshi government has been criticized for not doing enough for the Rohingya, the hundreds of thousands of the Rohingya that have been coming across the border. And is that a fair statement, given that the government is really overwhelmed with looks like a very chaotic situation on the ground? You know, give us a picture. What does it look like? What did you see? What is actually happening in terms of assistance, and what more needs to happen?
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. First, could I say I work with the Humanitarian Dialogue Centre in Geneva, but I'd like to speak in my personal capacity, which means I could speak more frankly. So if there are any press here, please respect that. I've just been to Dhaka, to Kuala Lumpur, to Bangkok, and before that to Yangon. We are preoccupied in the HD Centre with this because we spent the last 5 years in a very discreet dialogue with Myanmar, Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, trying to see if there were the sort of things you talked about, alternative approaches to this endless humanitarian scenario. I first went to Sitwe in the 1980s with UNHCR on the second wave of exodus and return. So it's decades old, and tragically it's now taken on new dimensions. The army, the ASA armed group attacks in the last months is a new development. There's been a RSO armed wing in the past which has not been effective, but this is a different level, and that's prompted this crisis. This is the biggest exodus historically for the Rohingya. It's also, in my experience, the biggest exodus in Southeast Asia since the Indochina crisis, which many of us worked on. 400,000 people in 3 weeks is a massive influx. Could I just give a couple of figures, Christina, maybe to put it in context? Yeah. The latest figures we have, and these are from various sources, but I think credible, 436,000 arrivals since 25 August. In the first 9 days, interestingly, 9,000 a day were crossing to Bangladesh, roughly. These figures are approximate. No one's registering in detail. In the next 9 days, the exodus rate was 33,000 a day into Bangladesh until the 11th of September. In the last 8 days, it's gone down to 6,500 a day. That's still a massive influx, but it's relatively smaller than it was at its peak. However, at the same time, there's continued to be burning villages in northern Rakhine State, as of yesterday. We think from all reports, probably burning vacant villages to destroy any possibility of return. Just one other quick figure, if I may. Mongdao, in the north of Rakhine State, you see on the map there, the most severely hit, the major center for the attacks and the major center for the response. There used to be 500,000 or thereabouts Rohingya. There's been no census, so these are best guesstimates. In Mongdao, there's probably less than 100,000 left today. And I think Human Rights Watch reports 214 villages destroyed. So probably 400,000, or most of them, have come from Mongdao. That's been the key epicenter of this crisis inside Rakhine State. But as you know, there is no international presence there able to move and to monitor. So all of the reports are from local sources or speculative or from satellite images or from reports of new arrivals. The second town to get hit, Ratidong, you'll see there down further to the east, about 55,000, a third of that population were Rohingya, and we think most of them have now also been forced out from Ratidong. And the third one is Butidong, further down, the most peaceful of all the Rohingya settlements. Some 300,000, we think, initially, and probably 45,000 have left from there. The last point on this, sorry, just to put it in context, the last concern is that this scorched earth policy by whomever, and don't ask me to get into that bit, the fear is it might spread to central Rakhine, which has been a separate Rohingya entity to some extent from the northern Rakhine. That hasn't happened yet, but I think the speculation is if there are further ASA attacks, which many experts expect to happen, why wouldn't there be? Then it may well be that this response, this very harsh, brutal response, will spread further. That's important because the present focus is on the, as you see, the northwestern corner, which is adjacent to Bangladesh. That's why people have been going across the Naf River and sometimes walking up around the top of the Naf River. If you go down to Butidong, for example, that's away from Bangladesh. If people leave from there, they'd leave in boats south normally to Malaysia. That stopped since 2015 because of the trafficking patrols, because of the crackdown on the boat organizers, because of the lack of boats, because Bangladesh stopped them, etc., etc. But that's a scenario we certainly can't rule out. Shall I say a word about the conditions in Bangladesh?
Yes, please.
Awful, horrendous. Cox's Bazar is a disaster zone. I've talked to colleagues and friends who've come back just this week from total chaos with the new arrivals. The UN agencies have not been present on the ground enough. The NGOs such as MSF and AICF and SAVE have been doing a brilliant job, apparently, totally overwhelmed. The local charitable response has been ad hoc, unmanaged, and in some cases has been so unprofessional that it's led to clashes between the recipients, desperate to grab the things thrown off the back of a truck, for example. There has been no internationally coordinated response 1 month after the crisis broke. There's complicated reasons for that. Bangladesh government is also hesitant about how much aid should be given to this area, which is an opposition area. It's hesitant about UNHCR's role because of its protection concerns. But nevertheless, I think everyone who's been there is horrified by the conditions in Cox's Bazar. I talked to one colleague who had worked in Somalia and Sudan. She said, I've never seen women and children in such bad conditions as in Cox's Bazar today. And you've probably seen some of the footage. The stories also not yet coming out from human rights and others will confirm massive sexual violence and abuse, almost certainly, and horror stories from children, traumatized children, in some cases too traumatized to speak from what they've witnessed in their villages. So an awful situation. The government of Bangladesh has kept the borders open. That's positive. They're trying to coordinate the system with the UN and others. There's a lot of local empathy for the Rohingyas in the Cox's Bazar area, but it is a politically sensitive area, and you've probably seen plans talked about for the military to relocate the populations. We'll see, but it's been discussed. Just quickly, KL, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, the one country in the region which said we will receive them all, we will receive the boats. Malaysia has split completely within ASEAN on the soft line, as they called it, of the ASEAN meeting, refused to endorse an ASEAN statement, have called for the expulsion of Myanmar from ASEAN, and have made very strong accusations about what has happened. There is a big divide as a result, no consensus within ASEAN. Last general point, Christina, Thailand, unfortunately, under the Prime Minister's guidance, has announced a push-off policy will be reinstated for all boat arrivals. And those who are not pushed off will be detained in detention centres, as they did previously. And they told us on Friday, but we'll separate the children. We said, well, what does that mean? Well, we won't put them in detention, but what do you do with the traumatized children of detained parents is another question. And we urge them to really try and reconsider that policy because it would cause huge problems also with Malaysia, who will resist that. So that's the sort of snapshot of where we are. Just the final is you've probably followed New York discussions. The UN Security Council is not going to make any decision on this because China has made it clear they will support Myanmar completely. India has also supported, they're not on the council, but they've also supported Myanmar's position, the two major ones who have. So there'll be no Security Council action on it. I guess, but I haven't followed it closely, there may be a General Assembly resolution with the Organization of Islamic Countries, OIC, 57 members, biggest bloc in the General Assembly of the UN, will probably put through something on that. but we'll wait and see. And the other thing that's continuing, as you know probably now, the UN fact-finding mission, high-level mission approved by the Human Rights Council, has started work in the region. It hasn't reported, and unfortunately it won't report formally until next year to the Council, formally. Parallel to that, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has also launched his own investigation. And that will be something which will be quicker and perhaps more useful.
Thank you, Dennis, for that overview. Maybe just a couple of follow-up questions for you. You've mentioned, complete chaos in Cox's Bazar and a range of problems from sexual violence to things falling off the back of trucks and swarms of people trying to get to them to potential separation of families and things like that. What should the aid community be focusing on now?
It's a big, coordinated international effort. I think the Secretary General, who's been very active, Guterres in New York on this, should pull the agencies together under a high-level humanitarian coordinator. There's no humanitarian coordinator for Bangladesh, tragically. There's no overall senior management of the operation. It needs that. It needs a consolidated appeal, which I think has just come out for 200 million, isn't it, for 6 months? 4 weeks later, but it's come. And it needs major donor backing to the Secretary General of the UN to make the inroads they need to make. They are not allowed into northern Rakhine State. UNHCR has been kept out of the new arrivals. That's an issue surely the donor governments should be concerned about. But I must say, there's been a stunning silence from Western leadership on this sort of issue. The only one I've seen, but please correct me if I've missed some, is Prime Minister Trudeau, who wrote a very strong letter, public letter, on Mong Da. I don't think any other Western leader has gone on the record as far as we have seen it. We've got the Dalai Lama and Malala and who was the other one? Tutu, yes, and the Bangladeshi. Thank you. Those are the voices. Where's the high moral authority of Western Europe, for example? US, okay, we understand it's not going to happen, but certainly Europe surely could join with Canada, and that's important, Christine, if you're going to get movement on the UN. As you know, the UN responds to governments and donors, and if they don't have that pressure, it may not move.
Okay, thank you. Dirk, if I can turn to you. What Dennis is saying is the international aid community, too little, too late, not there, not coordinated. It took until yesterday for your High Commissioner to say something, strong and very publicly about the situation. What's been taking so long? What is the situation for UNHCR? What does your access look like? What are your operations on the ground? And why is there this impression that you've been absent from the crisis thus far?
That we have been absent from the crisis?
There's a perception that it's too little, too late at this point, and the crisis has been going on for weeks, but that the UN agencies have been largely silent and largely absent from the situation on the ground. That's the perception that we're getting here, but you're there and you're coordinating this. So explain what it looks like to you, what your dealings with the government of Bangladesh have been, what your access is like, and how you intend to move forward.
Okay. How much time do you give me?
30 seconds. Take some time, five minutes. 10 minutes.
Try to prepare for a T sign if you don't see me stopping, if you don't get a sense that I'm coming to an end of my answer to your questions. Well, and forgive me, I'm looking in different directions here because I'm still also coordinating a very complex response. I've asked for some closed door for a little while, but there are disruptions. UNHCR has very much been present here from the very beginning. In fact, this current exodus that has finally actually had one positive impact of all the negativity and the suffering, etc., and that is very good international attention. It is tragic that it had to come to this first, but now we feel that even major news channels, newspapers have been keeping this issue on the front pages and in the first minute of evening news for quite some time since this crisis erupted. But there's a history to this. Long years of a kind of status quo where after the outflux of 250,000 people in 1991-92, where UNHCR was very much in the lead and cooperating with the government of Bangladesh to provide a response at that time, but then also to very quickly engage with Myanmar to come to a repatriation agreement, UNHCR then facilitating the return of some 230,000 out of 250,000 at that time, leaving a small number, maybe 15, 18,000 at the time, residual caseload that were not ready to repatriate, which grew by population growth and maybe with a few arrivals between 1995, let's say, and 2010 to some 30,000 people. They were consolidated in two camps at the time, Nayapara and Kutupalong, south of Cox's Bazar. And UNHCR was working there. Over the years, also, of course, known to those who are in this audience, were what the Bangladesh authorities called undocumented migrants or undocumented Muslims from Rakhine State. Some called them Rohingya refugees. UNHCR had a change of terminology over the years, but we kind of insisted that they were also refugees for political reasons. We chose to call them Myanmar Muslims from Rakhine State in a refugee-like situation, to whom UNHCR, however, was never really given access in the 2000s up until 2014, where the government of Bangladesh suddenly decided to give an access, but not to UNHCR, but to IOM, the International Organization for Migration. In 2012, we had the first violence, which was at the time more intercommunal violence, because between the Rakhine community and the Muslims slash Rohingya, that caused displacement chiefly inside Myanmar. You know about the IDP camps in and around Sitwe, partly in northern Rakhine State itself. Not so much external displacement, because Bangladesh, for example, closed its border. Dennis was just referring to the push-off policy by the Thai Navy, although people were coming into Thailand, but more Malaysia, Indonesia by boat through the Andaman Sea. Estimates, I think, if I'm not mistaken, some 25,000 people in those years. Then October 2016, where the first signs of an armed resistance inside northern Rakhine State caused the army to start its operations. I think initially, actually not formally the army, but the police guards, border police guards, and other armed forces of Myanmar that pushed over a formerly closed border into Bangladesh, some 70, 90,000 people. Estimates vary, and because registration was not carried out, this is not confirmed, who were basically absorbed in the registered official camps, the makeshift shelters of the undocumented illegal migrants, and local host populations. And then we had this latest incident on the 25th of August, which caused the displacement of 436,000 people. So if you put all the numbers together, you will arrive at something like 750 to 800,000 people currently being displaced from Rakhine State in Bangladesh alone. And I was very grateful for Dennis to explain a little bit that the demography of displacement, but there are many question marks, I think, as to how many people are still in their home villages or have already fled inside NRS trying to cross, those who may be considering to take boats or are on their way to areas where they could embark boats to either come on the southern route to Teknaf, southern tip of Cox's Bazar, or to other countries crossing the Andaman Sea. Now, all this, I needed this as a little bit of an introduction to say, when this crisis erupted and 400,000 people within 3 weeks indeed came across, UNHCR was very much ready to assume its full role, providing all the initial relief, including also coordination of relief that was being provided and pledged by many other actors, those who are already in Bangladesh and those who were ready to come in after this crisis started. However, UNHCR was told by the government, you stay in the registered camps and continue while IOM will organize the relief effort in the rest of Cox's Bazar, meaning all the makeshifts and the new spontaneous settlements, as well as the refugees in the host communities. That has now changed to a certain extent, although not formally. On the 14th of September, actually, the government issued a decision called the Rehabilitation of the Displaced People from Myanmar and Coordination of Relief Work, which adjusts in a very substantive way how the government of Bangladesh wants the support and relief effort to be coordinated, and what roles different actors on the ground will play. And this is what was possible to put on paper on the 14th of September, but this is probably just an interim arrangement until proper coordination mechanisms are put in place. There's still a lot of question marks even inside the UN regarding coordination mechanisms. Some things have been set up and we are supporting that as much as possible, but things are still falling into place. While massive aid is needed on the ground to save lives, etc., I want to say something maybe that will again divert from your original question, where's UNHCR? We're perceived not to be there. The initial relief effort, actually, as much as agencies who were already present were emptying their warehouses to throw in to help, to provide help that was already physically there to the most needy people on the ground, it was actually the local population of Bangladesh, the local host population in an already poverty-stricken area of Bangladesh and one of the poorest districts of Bangladesh who made the biggest difference. Spontaneous kitchens were set up to cook for people, hot meals, especially for the children, hand out whatever assistance they could, clothing, even plastic sheeting. In most situations, you will see a lot of UNHCR plastic sheeting, and there is a lot of that. But most of the plastic sheeting is the one that was available in the markets and that people were just like buying or donating locally from the resources that the local population had themselves. In some cases, perhaps the refugees themselves. The chaos of the very first 10 days, I think, has now started to change into a very initial phase of stabilization, where at least some very primitive shelter has been erected for the vast majority of the new arrivals. Many of the new arrivals are still hosted by refugees in the registered camps and in the old makeshift camps, but a whole vast area of new makeshift shelters has been erected that for me, as I was accompanying the High Commissioner for Refugees, who was touring the area for 24 hours, finishing his mission to Bangladesh this morning, I had the honor to accompany him, but also the horror of seeing what the whole situation was looking like on the ground. I was, just as a footnote, assigned as the head of UNHCR sub-office in Cox's Bazar for 2 years between 2011 and 13, and I know the area really well, but I was shocked to tears when I saw what had happened in the meantime. Whole forest areas or semi-forested areas around Kutupalong and Nayapara have gone completely and have made way for these makeshift shelters. As far as the eye can see, basically, amazing that this was even possible, and credit goes in a big way to Bangladesh as a government and nation to actually keep its borders open, something that we cannot take for granted from many governments these days. When Bangladesh is also always is already so overcrowded, and especially the district of Cox's Bazar has really shouldered a lot of burden in relation to the Rohingya situation for many years, if not decades. What is now going on is a massive relief effort has started and is starting to make a difference. I get the T sign, okay? So very briefly in a nutshell, shelter, non-food items, what we call co-relief items, health, wash, of course, vaccination, initial protection activities to identify the most vulnerable, starting to make sense of how this whole thing should be coordinated on the ground. So interagency coordination mechanisms are being beefed up. Other agencies are beefing up. We have sent about 40 people on emergency deployments from our rosters and capacities in Geneva and elsewhere. The other agencies are doing the same, WFP, OCHA, support of coordination, UNICEF, WHO, UNFPA, to name a few. The international NGOs who were already there, those who agreed to come in, are all throwing in what is possible. And I think by the day, you can pull up the SITREPs of the daily achievements from the various organizations' websites, and soon probably a portal to follow the entire situation and relief effort to get more details. But it has really started massively. The High Commissioner concluded his mission to Bangladesh by saying more is needed. We appeal to donors. We need to have a sustained relief effort, and we also need to think already now about the second phase design, where these people will find a more, at least medium-term, but semi-permanent shelter, and how do we go forward from here for Bangladesh to be able to continue to host these people, but also to have them at some stage ready for return whenever conducive.
Derek, listen, just a quick follow-up. Thank you for that, and thank you for painting the picture. That's the sort of relief picture. It does seem like it's taken a bit of time to gear up. I note that you said that the first response came from local organizations, which is extremely important, and it often does. But maybe just very, very briefly, can you tell us what UNHCR has been doing to support local organizations in that response? And also, what are you doing for the host communities who are opening up their homes and providing, on a volunteer basis, that assistance for all of these refugees? Very briefly.
Well, your first question, in fact, it was probably not so much local organizations. In the very beginning, it was just local people. Because local organizations also had to organize themselves. Very quickly, you saw then Dhaka, other parts of Bangladesh sending relief items. But initially, really, whatever the villagers had around this area, they were throwing in that support to save lives. the very first days. Then you gradually saw trucks and organizations that were not prior to this crisis active in the district come to the district and bring a lot of relief, which didn't come without problems. UNHCR and IOM on the ground, we tried to organize that a bit to not offload everything at first sight when you spotted the first large group of refugees and then dump everything, but to actually systematically achieve some better geographic coverage in the area, because it's vast. So I think what we did in the beginning, we organized our own supplies from what we had, including very close to the delivery point in our warehouses in the registered camps, Kutupalong and Nayapara, but also providing the needed guidance and intelligence to those incoming organizations, where to go and where we knew no assistance had gone yet, to redirect them, etc.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll get to host communities a bit
later.
later.
There was a second question on our support to host communities, what we are planning.
Go ahead, quickly. Yeah.
We have factored support into our now more consolidated planning for the next 6 months. We are almost ready to launch an appeal together with other agencies. And there's a component that provides assistance to beef up not only infrastructure, but also cash injections to recompensate the local host communities for what they've done, so that they can replenish their own food supplies, etc., and stabilize themselves.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now I'd like to get to Nay, who has been sort of viewing this whole situation from afar, but very much in touch with people on the ground and other Rohingyas around the world. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has branded this situation a textbook case of ethnic cleansing. And I wanted to know, from your perspective, is that what you're hearing from the people that you're speaking to? Is that a fair assessment of what's going on? And is using those types of labels helpful or harmful to the situation?
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak here today. And I have been speaking with most of the victims from the Rakhine State since 2012. And I have listened many horrific stories from them. So this is not just simply happening since 2012, because the world just came to know that the communal violence started in 2012, and they are just thinking this violence are continuing since 2012. But this actually happening since 1978. This is the long decade persecution. We have to get the whole picture from the 1978. Actually, the government, the Burmese government, and the majority of the Buddhists inside the country are accusing us that we are the illegal Bengali immigrant from the Bangladesh. And also there are many propaganda that we are invading the country. So this is the main reason they are expelling the whole population from the country. Not just simply they are driving out. There are many propaganda against us. And in before the 1978, we all Rohingya were treated as an equal citizen in Burma. But in 1974, the government launched an operation called Sabay Operation, which is Jasmine Operation, and they have taken away all our national registration card, and they launched the operation in 1978, which called the Dragon King Operation, and they have driven out about 250,000. Again in 1991. 250,000 somewhere are still remaining in Bangladesh. Again in 2012, after the violence, about 150,000 fled to Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And again, in last year, 2060, they have driven out about 90,000. In this year, about 440,000. So these all are the pre-planned. They are like in the other ethnic area as well. We have about more than 100 ethnic insurgency group. So they are not expelling all other ethnic group. One, they have the clash with the Burmese military troop. So now they are taking this as an excuse and expelling the whole population. The people who remain in the country are also under threat by the Rakhine extremists and the military troop. They every day they are threatening them to flee from the village. So what the UN described is exactly the term they have to use, and also this all the experts are saying this is the genocide, and they deny our existence, they deny our identity, they are denying our food, they are denying all our right. We before 1992, all the Rohingya students can join the university, like the professional institution, medical, or the engineering, or the law, no problem at all. But in 1992, they start impose the all restriction on us. We have no freedom for the education, and no freedom for the healthcare, and also the freedom of the marriage, freedom of birth, the freedom of movement. From one village to another, also we need the special permission from the village administration. So all these people were kept in the open air prison, and the young people who have no future, they have decided to join the armed group, and finally this violence erupted. So the government must respond to the armed group only. They should not respond to the civilian. As of now, since August 25, at least according to our record, because I have the network of local activists based in Putirong, Mondo, and Ratirong, and also in Sitwe. So they are documenting everything there. So according to our record, more than 4,000 Rohingya civilians have been killed since August 25. Men, women, and the children, and also the small baby, they were beheaded, and they burned alive, slaughtered, shot dead. And also there are many rape cases, sexual violence against the women and the girls. In most cases, they have raped the women and the girl, then they burn them alive. So this is a very horrific you are hearing in this 21st century. So, in my opinion, the UN should investigate more, and they should use the term genocide to, because it is as I am not an expert, I am an activist. I cannot tell you exact for the term, but I am just referring according to the expert what they are saying. In the Queen Mary University also they have said this is the completely genocide. So they should use the correct term, and to pressure, so the world can pressure more to the Burmese government to stop this all atrocity against the Rohingya people.
Maybe one quick question for you, Nay. Thank you for that. What have you've been talking? You've got a lot of followers, for example, on Twitter and on Facebook, and you're talking to people who are crossing the border all the time. What are they saying about what it is that they need most? Those who are leaving, those who have left.
Yeah, they got the short notice, like 1-2 hours before. The military Boragat police and the Rakhine extremists came into their village, and they give them the two options: either you leave from home, or you get killed inside the home. So the people flee from the home, and like from Budiro, they need at least 7 to 10 days, sometimes 13 days, sometimes 14 days. They don't have any food. They have just, most of the people, they take their solar panel and the mobile phone with them to contact each other, and they don't have any food, they don't have any clothes. They just try to save their life. From Mongdo, it takes about the 5 day to 7 day to reach to the Bangladesh, and also from the Ratirong, same like a week they need, and many people trap in the beach and at the hillside inside the mountain for a few days. They have no food. I have posted many videos they have sent me from the mountainside and the hillside from the beach. I have spoken with many people while they are there, and the children are crying. They said they don't even in the beach. There were many thousand, almost 80,000 people were there from the various places from 3 townships. They gathered there and waiting for the boat for many days. But later they were rescued by the Bangladeshi local, and also I think some NGO also assisted them. But they told me this. They told me they don't even know exactly how many people died there just because they don't have the food and they don't have anything to eat, even the water or anything.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nate, for that. I mean, I think we're just painting a really horrible picture here among all of our panelists of what's happening as people are crossing the borders and fleeing. Maybe just turning now to the situation in Myanmar itself, because what we're hearing from you, Nate, is a situation where people who are living there have been stripped of their rights, their statehood, their dignity, and whose lives are constantly under threat. There are also reports now of the government wanting to set up official camps where the villages have been. Lilian, maybe if I could turn to you now to talk to us a little bit about the situation in Myanmar itself. You and your organization has been working with the Rohingya there for quite some time, trying to assist them. What have you seen any improvement or any movement on the part of the Myanmar government to be able to help these people or to provide them with some level of status in that country? And if not, what do we need to do now to make sure that happens?
Thank you, Christina. I think that the effort of the Myanmar government that's been most significant to try to improve the situation in Rakhine has been the setting up of the Rakhine Advisory Commission that was led by Mr. Kofi Annan and was recently concluded. Unfortunately, the submission of his final report took place exactly a day or hours, actually, within the attacks by ARSA on the 25th of August and the subsequent crackdown and new clearance operations that started by the military in response to that, which have been incredibly brutal and again have closed off access to most aid organizations inside northern Rakhine, the areas that have been affected, and also have made things even more difficult in other areas of Rakhine State as well, where you still have displaced populations and very vulnerable populations who've been affected by the 2012 violence and numerous other upheavals since then. So I think that in terms of humanitarian access inside, it's extremely difficult right now. There has been, over the last few weeks, a negotiation of an arrangement with the ICRC and the Myanmar Red Cross that has been taking shape, although, from what I hear, actually our organization, Gatanio, isn't really on the ground. We actually work more in the region. But we've been hearing, and I do a lot of work as well inside Myanmar, and what we are hearing is that actually the humanitarian access, even for the Red Cross, is actually very difficult. It's not, there isn't really, there isn't at all free and unhindered access, certainly for the ICRC. Even for the Myanmar Red Cross, their work is really going through the government, and actually most areas in the affected territory are not being reached at all. There is some aid being distributed around the towns, but actually outside the towns, there's very, very limited access for agencies. And a lot of the affected populations, the ones who are fleeing from the violence, the ones who are probably along the journey, towards the Bangladeshi border, are actually not being reached by aid at all. So I think the situation inside right now is extremely difficult, which is why there's also been a lot of effort to try to see if there's another channel of access that can be opened up. And there's been a lot of lobbying around alternatives, including seeing what can be done at the level of the ASEAN member states could actually bring to the table on this, the same way that they did after Cyclone Nargis, which was, of course, a natural disaster, but also similarly a situation where you had a lot of antagonism between the Myanmar government and the international community at the time. The anti-international sentiment in Rakhine is extremely high. And this is another reason why it's been proposed actually that ASEAN might be able to play a stronger role, being obviously a regional actor and one that Myanmar is a member state of, that it may actually be more accepted than international organizations, UN, INGOs, and even the Red Cross. There were even incidents in which Red Cross vehicles as well were being targeted. So it has been extremely difficult.
Thanks, Lilian. Earlier Dennis was saying that ASEAN hasn't really come up with a coherent position on this yet, and that there was a meeting held in New York last week, was it, in order to discuss what its role might be. And you're seeing divisions and not unified response. What is the prospect for an organization like ASEAN to really play a major role here?
I think I have a slightly different interpretation from Dennis. I do think, yes, there are differences and there are divisions, but I think that what is clear is that ASEAN does want to play a role, including Malaysia. My government as well. I'm Malaysian, and we've been talking a lot to the government here, and they are extremely angry with the situation, extremely frustrated, and they understand that aid is not enough. And I think that's why they've been extremely upset with what they want to see is political commitment to resolving or somehow getting back on track and looking at how the recommendations from the Kofi Annan report can actually start to be considered and implemented. And they're not seeing that. So the discussions right now within ASEAN have been mainly around how do we, let's send more aid. And some of it's been bilateral. And then there's been a lot of discussion amongst the foreign ministers to say, well, we need a much more coordinated approach to this. And the Indonesian foreign minister, who's been playing a central role in this, has actually been doing a lot of work to talk to the other foreign ministers and convince them that there was a need to have this foreign ministers meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York last week. When that meeting happened, there were concerns that were raised by many member states, and Malaysia in particular raised its concerns. And Malaysia has been extremely vocal actually since last year, since the first stage of this military clearance operation started against this new armed group, ARSA. That was in October last year. So since then, Malaysia has become this very vocal player in the region and has gone as far as naming the kind of situation and the kinds of violence that is happening in Rakhine as ethnic cleansing. There's even been discussion, words like genocide are used as well in discussions about this crisis. So it has been taking a very critical role. But at the same time, it doesn't mean, and we've heard this from the foreign ministry directly, in fact, even today, a confirmation that Malaysia's distancing itself from the statement of the chairman of at this foreign ministers meeting does not indicate an unwillingness to participate in any kind of humanitarian assistance effort that will take place. And I think one of the most significant things that came out of that meeting was actually an agreement by Myanmar to allow the AHA Center, this is the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, to play a role in the delivery of humanitarian assistance inside Myanmar, inside Rakhine State. And that's extremely significant. What, of course, needs to be negotiated now is what that really means. What does that mandate look like? Doesn't mean that everything, AHA is basically coordinating aid sent by the member states to this Red Cross arrangement that's already been established? Or does it actually mean that AHA is going to be able to play a role in facilitating an ASEAN coordinated response with the Myanmar government, which would actually be managed and facilitated and coordinated by ASEAN, distributed also with ASEAN alongside the Myanmar government, which is, I think, actually what a lot of the humanitarian agencies would prefer to ensure impartiality and that aid is actually being distributed to populations in need.
Thanks, Lilian. Nate, listening to what Lilian has just said, do you think that ASEAN can play an instrumental role in Myanmar for delivering the assistance and the protection that people in Myanmar need, and for mobilizing or at least getting the government to act differently toward the people in Rakhine State?
Yeah. Actually, this ASEAN has the non-interference policy. These are bearing everything, Like Malaysia is playing the role since last year. They have changed their policy according to their statement. But there are the largest Muslim country like Indonesia. They are always trying to negotiate with the government, with the Burmese government, like they are trying to change the situation as a humanitarian crisis. This is not the actually, yes, there is the humanitarian crisis, but as Liliana told us, there should be the political commitment. The whole situation can be changed if the Burmese government is willing to change their national policy, because this is not simply happening time to time. They have the very long-term plan to expel all the Rohingya population from the country. So all the ASEAN country, they have to understand that this Burmese government is trying to expel the whole population from the country by any means, so that they cannot just simply send the humanitarian aid and they settle the things. There is the most important is to restore this citizenship right of the Rohingya people and the ethnic right to restore, because we have got all the right since before after the independence of Burma. So they have to this all the ASEAN country, because this is the regional threat as well, because from the Rakhine State, many people fled to Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and also to the Australia. So this is a regional problem they have to solve for the not to face again. But this is happening again and again. And in a few months later, the people in Bangladesh, they will start looking for the boat, and they will try to flee to Thailand or Malaysia. So all the ASEAN countries, they must solve this problem to stop. The most important is to restore the right of the Rohingya, so that they will not need to flee from the country, and also stop all the persecution against the people. So ASEAN has to try to stop all these things. Instead of they just help the humanitarian aid, they have to change the national policy of the Burmese government.
Thanks very much, Nate. I mean, what I'd like to do now, thanks to all of our panelists for painting this picture for us, both of the Rohingya fleeing into Bangladesh and to other countries, but also the situation in Myanmar proper.